In 2013, Canadians lined up in the freezing cold before sunrise to get inside. Not for a concert, not for a phone launch, for a Target. For 2 decades, millions of Canadians had driven across the border, sometimes hours each way, just to walk the aisles of an American Target. They brought back the red bags like souvenirs. They talked about the experience the way people talk about somewhere they wish they could live. Then Target finally came to Canada. 133 stores, 9 provinces. The biggest retail launch in Canadian history. 22 months later, every single one of those stores was dark. 17,600 people lost their jobs in a single morning. $2 billion gone. And the customers who had waited 20 years for this moment were left standing in parking lots, staring at locked doors and liquidation signs. How does the most anticipated retail arrival in Canadian history become the most catastrophic retail failure the country had ever seen? The answer wasn't in Canada. It was in a boardroom in Minneapolis, where a company looked at a foreign country, saw a mirror, and never once questioned what they were looking at. Greg Steinhoffel did not look like a man making a mistake. In 2011, he had every reason to feel confident. He had spent 30 years at Target Corporation, working his way up from a merchandising trainee in 1979 to the chief executive office in 2008. He knew the business the way a carpenter knows wood, the grain of it, the weight of it, where it holds and where it splits. Under his leadership, Target was thriving. The company operated nearly 1,800 stores across the United States. It had carved out a retail identity that no competitor had managed to replicate. The strange, almost irrational loyalty of customers who called themselves Target people. Not Walmart shoppers, not Kmart shoppers, Target people. There was a difference, and everyone knew it. Steinhoffel wanted to take that difference somewhere new. Canada was the obvious choice. It shared a border nearly 4,000 miles long. The language was the same, mostly. The culture looked familiar from a distance. Canadians watched American television, followed American sports, and for years had been crossing into the United States specifically to shop at Target. Market research confirmed what executives already believed. Canadian consumers didn't just tolerate Target. They wanted it. They had wanted it for a long time. In January 2011, Target Corporation announced the deal that would make it happen. Hudson's Bay Company, one of the oldest corporations in North America, founded in 1670, had been operating a discount chain called Zellers across Canada for decades. Zellers was tired, its stores were dated, its brand had faded, and Hudson's Bay was ready to move on. Target saw an opportunity. For $1,825 million, Target purchased the leases on 220 Zellers locations spread across the country. The plan was straightforward, at least on paper. Convert the Zellers stores into Targets. Bring the experienced Canadians had been crossing the border to find, right to their own neighborhoods. Cornell McKnight, one of the senior executives overseeing the expansion, told the press it was the most natural international move the company could make. What the press releases did not say, what the maps spread across those Minneapolis conference tables did not show, was the reality waiting inside those 220 locations. Zellers had not been built to Target standards. It had never needed to be. Zellers was a discount chain, and discount chains make different choices. The ceilings were lower. The floor plans were irregular. Many locations sat in aging strip malls or second-tier shopping centers, far from the high-traffic corridors where Target's American stores had been built to thrive. Some locations were so physically limited that no amount of renovation could make them feel like the Target that Canadian shoppers had experienced across the border. And renovation was going to be expensive. Estimates would later show that Target spent between $10 and $11 million converting each Zellers location. Multiply that across more than 100 stores, and the money was gone before a single Canadian customer had pushed a red cart down a single aisle. But in 2011, those numbers were projections. And projections, in the hands of optimists, have a way of bending toward belief. There was something else the maps did not show. Target Corporation had spent 50 years building a supply chain in the United States, a network of distribution centers, vendor relationships, and logistics systems refined through decades of operation. Every bottle of shampoo, every bath towel, Every pack of batteries that landed on a Target shelf in Ohio or Texas or Florida had traveled through a system engineered to put it exactly there, at exactly the right time, in exactly the right quantity. Canada did not have that system. Canada would need its own. Building a retail supply chain from scratch in a foreign country while simultaneously converting over 100 stores and hiring thousands of new employees, it was not impossible. Other retailers had done it, but those retailers had done it slowly. They had opened a handful of stores, learned the market, fixed what was broken, and then expanded. Target Corporation had already paid for 220 leases. Slow was not an option they had left themselves. In the spring of 2013, the first Target Canada stores opened for business. Greg Steinhoffel flew to Ontario for the occasion. He walked the aisles. He smiled for the cameras. Outside, in the parking lots of cities across the country, Canadians were doing something they had genuinely looked forward to for years. They were finally walking into a Target that was theirs. What none of them knew, what most of the people inside the company were only beginning to understand, was that the foundation beneath all of it had already cracked. It had cracked before the first store ever opened, and no one in Minneapolis had wanted to hear about it. To understand what Target Canada meant to Canadians, you have to understand what Target America had already been to them for 20 years. The border between Canada and the United States is the longest international boundary in the world. For most of its length, it is invisible, a line on a map running through farmland and forest and quiet suburban streets. And for decades, Canadians living within driving distance of that line had developed a habit, a ritual really. Load the family into the car on a Saturday morning, cross into New York or Vermont or Michigan or Washington State, stop at a Target on the way. It sounds ordinary. It was not ordinary. It was a cultural phenomenon with its own vocabulary. Canadians called it cross-border shopping, and by the early 2000s, it had become a minor economic force. Studies estimated that Canadians spent billions of dollars annually in American stores, and Target was consistently at the top of the list of destinations. Not because Canada lacked stores, Canada had stores, but Canadian retail for most of the 20th century had been a narrower experience. Fewer choices, higher prices, less of the particular pleasure that comes from walking into a well-lit space where everything feels considered, where the store brand looks as good as the name brand, where a cart full of household basics and a new throw pillow and a birthday card somehow feels like a treat rather than a chore. That was Target. That specific feeling. Canadians who had experienced it did not forget it. They brought the red bags home like proof. They recommended specific store locations to each other. They built Target runs into road trips the way an earlier generation had built Howard Johnson stops into family vacations. As a destination inside the journey, a reward that organized the day around itself. And when they came home, they told people who had never been, and those people wanted to go. By the time Target announced its Canadian expansion in 2011, there were Canadians who had never once set foot in an American Target but had heard about it so many times from so many people they trusted that they had already formed an attachment to a place they had never visited. That is not brand awareness. That is mythology. Target Canada's marketing team understood this, and they used it. The advertising campaign that preceded the 2013 openings was confident and warm. It did not oversell. It did not need to. It simply reminded Canadians of what they already believed Target to be. Bright, affordable, stylish in an accessible way, a store that respected the intelligence of the people walking through its doors. The red bullseye appeared on billboards in Toronto and Vancouver and Calgary. Television spots showed exactly the kind of effortless shopping experience that had made Canadians drive 2 hours across the border to fill a cart. The anticipation built for months. Then on March 5, 2013, the first 24 Target Canada stores opened simultaneously. In Guelph, Ontario, customers lined up before the doors opened. In Milton, in Fergus, across the province, in temperatures that had not yet decided to become spring, people stood in coats and waited. Local news cameras were there. The mood was genuinely celebratory, the kind of energy that surrounds things people have looked forward to for a long time. The doors opened. The people walked in. And almost immediately, something felt wrong. It was hard to name at first. The store looked like a Target. The logo was right. The colors were right. The layout followed the familiar geometry of every Target these shoppers had visited across the border. But the shelves were not right. Gaps where products should have been. Sections that looked half-stocked. Items that were present but in the wrong sizes, the wrong quantities. A children's clothing rack with mediums and extra larges, but nothing in between. And the prices. The prices were not what people had expected. Target Canada's costs were real. Importing product, paying Canadian duties, operating a supply chain being assembled on the fly, all of it added up. The result was a price gap that customers noticed immediately. A product that cost $22 at a Target in Buffalo was selling for $27 in Guelph. It was not a dramatic difference, but it was a consistent one. And consistency in retail cuts both ways. The same consistency that had made Target America feel trustworthy was now making Target Canada feel like a quiet, broken promise. Canadians had a name for it within weeks. They called it the Target tax. The complaints appeared on social media almost immediately. Empty shelves photographed and posted. Price comparisons documented side by side. The question asked over and over in comment sections and Facebook groups. Why doesn't this feel like the Target we know? But here is what matters about those early weeks. Most customers did not give up. They went back. They gave it time. They told themselves that a new store needed time to find its footing, that the inventory issues would be sorted out, that the prices would come down once the operation stabilized. They had waited 20 years. They could wait a little longer. What they did not know, what they had no way of knowing, was that the problems they were seeing on the sales floor were not growing pains. They were symptoms of something that had already gone irreversibly wrong. And it had started not in the stores, but in a database, in millions of lines of product data entered by contractors who had never set foot in a Canadian Target, working from spreadsheets that no one had properly verified, feeding numbers into a system that the company did not fully understand and could not reliably control. The shelves were empty because the system thought they were full, and nobody in a position to fix it wanted to say so out loud. In the history of retail, the difference between a successful expansion and a catastrophic one often comes down to a single variable. Not capital, not brand strength, not even market demand, though all of those matter. The variable that most reliably separates the chains that grew intelligently from the chains that grew themselves to death is patience. The willingness to open 5 stores before opening 50. To learn what works in a new market before committing to what should work. To treat the first locations not as proof of concept, but as classrooms. Places where the assumptions built into the business model get tested against reality, corrected, and refined before they are multiplied across hundreds of locations. Target Corporation understood this principle. In the United States, the company had applied it with discipline over decades. The expansion from a regional Minnesota discount chain into a national retailer had been deliberate and sequenced. Each new market entry built on the operational knowledge accumulated in previous ones. The supply chain grew with the store count. The vendor relationships deepened as the volume justified deeper investment. The institutional knowledge of what a Target store required to function correctly, in terms of staffing, inventory management, local market conditions, and customer behavior, accumulated year by year, location by location. None of that accumulated knowledge applied to Canada. Canada was a new country, a new regulatory environment, a new logistics landscape, and a new competitive market. The knowledge that had made Target successful in Georgia or Colorado or Oregon was not transferable to Ontario or Alberta or British Columbia in any direct way. It was a starting point at best, a set of principles that would need to be relearned in a new context through new experience, against new conditions. A proper Canadian pilot program would have looked something like this. Open 10 stores in a single province. Run them for a full fiscal year. Stress test the supply chain. Identify the SAP data errors before they metastasized across a national system. Learn which product categories resonated with Canadian consumers and which needed adjustment. Build vendor relationships with Canadian suppliers who understood the market. Fix what was broken in a contained environment before scaling what worked. That pilot program never happened. The reason it never happened was sitting in the lease agreements that Target had signed when it purchased the Zellers portfolio. 220 locations spread across 9 provinces, with lease obligations running on timelines that did not wait for operational readiness. Every month a converted location sat unopened was a month of rent paid on a building generating zero revenue, compounding the losses on the capital already deployed, feeding the financial pressure that the expansion had created from the moment the deal was signed. The Zellers purchase had not just bought Target a set of store locations, it had bought them a timeline. And the timeline said, open, open fast, open everywhere. The financial model required it, so they did. The first 24 Target Canada stores opened on March 25, 2013. Within 2 months, that number had grown to 68. By the end of the year, 124 stores were operating. By early 2014, the chain had reached its full footprint of 133 locations, spanning everything from large urban centers like Toronto and Vancouver to mid-sized markets like Lethbridge and Sudbury. 133 stores in 12 months. For context, when Walmart entered Canada in 1994, it acquired 122 Woolco locations and spent years converting and stabilizing them before pursuing further growth. The process was deliberate, sequential, and grounded in the recognition that a new market required new learning. Walmart Canada today is one of the most successful retail operations in the country, built on a foundation of patience that Target, 20 years later, did not allow itself. The pace of Target Canada's expansion meant that every problem in the system, every data error in the SAP database, every gap in the supply chain, every mismatch between a Zellers floor plan and Target's operational requirements was being multiplied and compounded in real time across new locations before anyone had solved it in the existing ones. The expansion was not building on a foundation. It was building the foundation and the structure simultaneously, at full speed, without the ability to stop and verify that the ground beneath was solid. The people being hired to staff these stores experienced the consequences directly. Thousands of Canadians took jobs at Target Canada in 2013, drawn by the brand's reputation and the genuine excitement that surrounded the expansion. Many of them had shopped at American Target stores. They knew what the brand was supposed to be. They came in with enthusiasm and a frame of reference, a clear picture of the standard they were being asked to maintain. What they found when they arrived was an operation being assembled under conditions that made maintaining any standard extraordinarily difficult. Training programs had been developed in Minnesota and translated, sometimes imperfectly, for a Canadian workforce. In Quebec, where French language requirements were legally mandated, initial training materials were provided primarily in English. The oversight was not malicious. It was the kind of error that happens when a company designs a program for its own culture and forgets, in the details, that it is operating somewhere else. But in Quebec, it was more than an oversight. It was a signal, visible to the people receiving the training, that the organization they had joined had not fully thought through what it meant to operate in their province. Store managers hired from outside the Target system faced a particular challenge. The systems they were being trained on were not yet stable. The inventory management tools that their training materials described were producing outputs in their actual stores that did not match what the training had prepared them for. They were being asked to run operations according to a playbook written for a system that was not functioning as the playbook assumed. The franchise dimension that characterized Target's American expansion, the network of independent franchise operators who had built personal stakes in the success of their individual locations, did not exist in Canada. Target Canada was entirely corporate-owned. Every store was a company store, every manager a company employee, every decision a corporate decision. In theory, this created consistency. In practice, it created a system in which the people closest to the problems, the store managers, the department leads, the floor staff, had no ownership stake that might have motivated a different kind of problem-solving and limited authority to improvise solutions outside the parameters of a corporate system that was failing them. The distribution network that was supposed to supply these stores was under pressure from the first week of operation. The Cornwall Distribution Center was the primary hub, designed to supply stores across Ontario and beyond. From its earliest days of operation, the facility was handling the consequences of the SAP data errors, receiving product that did not match purchase orders, processing shipments that the system had generated based on corrupted inventory information, and trying to route goods to stores whose actual needs bore little relationship to what the software believed those needs to be. Trucking routes had been established, contracted, and scheduled. The schedules ran whether or not the product being shipped was the product the stores needed. The fixed costs of the logistics network accumulated regardless of whether the network was delivering value. And the stores at the end of those routes received what the system sent, not what they had asked for, not what their customers were looking for, but whatever the broken feedback loop between the software and the supply chain had produced. By mid-2013, the pattern was visible to anyone working inside the operation. The expansion had created a system too large to correct through the informal workarounds that store-level employees were attempting. The problem was not in any single store or any single distribution run. It was structural, embedded in the data architecture, replicated across every location that had been opened on top of it, and growing harder to address with each new store that joined the network. The machine had been built at full scale before anyone had confirmed it could run, and now it was running across 9 provinces in 133 stores, serving millions of Canadian customers who had been promised something that the machine, as built, was constitutionally incapable of delivering. The expansion was complete. The foundation was not. There is a particular kind of corporate blindness that only appears at the top. It is not stupidity. The people who built Target Corporation to a $40 billion retailer were not stupid. They were experienced, data-driven, and genuinely talented at the business of retail. But there is a kind of success that becomes its own worst enemy. A track record so strong that it starts to function as evidence against doubt. Every concern gets filtered through the same question: has this stopped us before? And when the answer is always no, the question eventually stops being asked. By the summer of 2013, Target Canada's marketing machine was operating at full power, and it was magnificent. The advertising was polished and consistent. The red bullseye was everywhere. On highway billboards, on transit shelters, in the pages of flyers dropped into millions of Canadian mailboxes. Television spots showed gleaming aisles and smiling families, and the kind of effortless abundance that Target had always promised. The message was the same message that had worked in the United States for decades. Expect more, pay less. Style and value, together, without compromise. It worked as advertising. In the narrow sense of the word, it worked perfectly. Brand awareness for Target Canada reached levels that most new retail entrants spend years trying to achieve. Canadians knew Target was there. Canadians went to Target. The store count was growing. By the end of 2013, 124 locations were operating across 9 provinces. By early 2014, that number would reach 133. On paper, the expansion looked exactly like what a successful retail rollout is supposed to look like. The paper was the problem. Inside those 133 stores, the experience that the advertising promised was not the experience customers were finding. The SAP inventory system, the software backbone that was supposed to manage product ordering, distribution, and shelf replenishment across the entire chain, was producing results that defied logic. Stores in Manitoba were receiving shipments of summer lawn furniture in November. A distribution center in Cornwall, Ontario, was holding thousands of units of product that no store had ordered, while stores across Ontario were sending daily reports of empty shelves in categories as basic as laundry detergent and children's underwear. Customers walked in expecting the Target they knew. They found something that looked like Target the way a photograph looks like a person, recognizable, but missing something essential. The price gap had not closed. The Target tax, as Canadians had taken to calling it, remained stubbornly consistent. A basket of goods that cost $80 at a Target in Minnesota cost between $90 and $95 at a Target in Ontario. For occasional purchases, the difference was tolerable. For families doing regular household shopping, It was a reason to go somewhere else, and Canadian shoppers had somewhere else to go. Walmart Canada had been operating successfully for nearly 2 decades. Canadian Tire, Loblaws, Shoppers, Drug Mart, the domestic retail landscape was not a vacuum waiting to be filled. It was a competitive market with established players who understood Canadian consumers, Canadian supply chains, and Canadian pricing realities in ways that Target, operating from Minneapolis, had never fully reckoned with. The social media commentary was becoming harder to ignore. Canadian consumer blogs were publishing detailed comparisons. Reddit threads documented the empty shelves with photographs dated and timestamped. A consistent narrative was forming in the public conversation. Target Canada was a disappointment. Not a disaster, not yet, but a sustained, grinding disappointment that was eroding the goodwill that 2 decades of anticipation had built. Inside the stores, the people who saw this every day were the employees. They were the ones standing at the end of aisles that should have held product and didn't. They were the ones answering the same question from customers. Why is this shelf empty? When will this be back in stock? Without any reliable answer to give. Because the system that was supposed to tell them was telling them something that wasn't true. The system said the product was there, the product was not there. And explaining that gap to a customer who had driven 20 minutes to buy something specific, who had seen it advertised in a flyer that arrived in their mailbox that morning, that was a conversation that happened hundreds of times a day in 133 stores across 9 provinces. The employee experience at Target Canada in 2013 and 2014 was defined by that gap. The gap between what the company said and what was real, between what the advertising showed and what the shelves held, between the reports being sent to Minneapolis and the reality being lived on the floor. How long could a company keep selling a promise it was no longer able to keep? The answer was already being calculated, not in the stores, not by the employees, not by the Canadian customers who kept giving the brand the benefit of the doubt month after month because they had invested too much anticipation to let go of it easily. The answer was being calculated in quarterly financial reports, in loss projections, in the kind of numbers that do not stay in boardrooms forever. And by the end of 2013, those numbers had become impossible to explain away. The hype machine was still running, the advertising was still polished, the red bullseye still gleamed on billboards from Halifax to Vancouver. But behind the billboards, the people who built this knew something had gone wrong that a marketing budget could not fix. To understand what broke Target Canada from the inside, you have to understand a piece of software that most customers never think about and every retailer cannot live without. SAP is an enterprise resource planning system, a German-engineered software platform used by some of the largest companies in the world to manage the movement of goods from manufacturer to warehouse to store shelf. It tracks inventory, it generates purchase orders, it tells a distribution center what to send, when to send it, and how much. When it works correctly, it is invisible. Products appear on shelves, customers buy them, more products arrive. The whole system breathes in and out without anyone noticing the mechanism. When it works incorrectly, the consequences are not abstract. Empty shelves, duplicate shipments, product ordered in quantities that bear no relationship to actual demand. A store in Winnipeg receiving 40 units of a product it sells 2 of per month, while a store in Ottawa runs out of the same product and cannot get a reorder filled. The software does not know it is wrong. It processes the data it has been given and produces outputs accordingly. The problem is not the software. The problem is the data. And Target Canada's data was wrong from the very beginning. When Target purchased the Zellers leases in 2011, one of the first tasks was building out the product database that would feed the SAP system. Every item that would be sold in a Target Canada store needed to be entered into the system, described, categorized, and assigned the measurements and specifications that the software would use to calculate shipping quantities, shelf space, and reorder points. It was painstaking work, and there was an enormous amount of it. Target Canada would eventually carry tens of thousands of individual products. The work was outsourced to third-party contractors, and the contractors made errors, not small errors, not occasional errors, systematic errors embedded in the foundation of the database, that would corrupt the outputs of every decision the system made downstream. A product listed as 18 inches in length had been entered as 18 feet. A case pack that contained 12 units had been entered as containing 1. Items that were sold individually were recorded as sold by the pallet. The units of measurement were wrong. The dimensions were wrong. The pack sizes were wrong. Each individual error looked minor in isolation. Across hundreds of thousands of product entries, they created a system that was functionally detached from reality. The SAP software was processing accurate calculations based on inaccurate information and producing results that looked internally consistent while bearing no reliable relationship to what was actually happening in the stores. The Cornwall Distribution Centre, Target Canada's primary logistics hub in Ontario, became the physical manifestation of the problem. Product arrived that no store had requested. Product that stores needed failed to arrive. The facility filled with inventory that was sitting in the wrong place, in the wrong quantities, at the wrong time. Workers put in overtime trying to manually reconcile what the system said against what was actually on the shelves in loading docks. It was like trying to navigate a city using a map drawn for a different city, one that looked similar enough to be plausible, but wrong in every specific detail that mattered. The people closest to the problem saw it almost immediately. Employees in the distribution network flagged the discrepancies in the first weeks of operation. Store managers submitted reports documenting the gap between what the inventory system showed and what was physically present on their shelves. Logistics staff raised concerns through internal channels. The data was wrong, they said. The system cannot be trusted. The stores cannot be properly stocked until the underlying data is corrected. Those reports traveled up the chain, and somewhere in the distance between the Cornwall warehouse floor and the executive offices in Minneapolis, the urgency got lost. This was not a conspiracy. It was something more ordinary and in many ways more damning. It was the organizational behavior of a company that had never failed at retail. A company whose institutional instincts were calibrated for success, not for crisis. The culture at Target Corporation rewarded confidence and execution. It was not a culture that had developed strong reflexes for receiving bad news, sitting with it, and restructuring plans around it. When people brought problems forward, the response tended toward reassurance. The system would stabilize. The data issues would be corrected. The stores would find their footing. They did not stabilize. The data issues were not corrected, not meaningfully, not at the scale required. Fixing the SAP database properly would have required halting the expansion, pulling back, and rebuilding the data architecture from the ground up. That would have meant admitting, publicly and internally, that the most ambitious retail expansion in Canadian history had been launched on a broken foundation. Nobody was ready to say that, and so the machine kept running. New stores kept opening. The advertising kept running. The red bullseye kept appearing on new billboards in new cities, and inside every one of those stores, in every province, in every category, the shelves kept telling the same quiet story. Something was wrong here, something that a press release could not fix, that a new marketing campaign could not paper over, that more store openings could not outrun. When the people who see a problem every day are not the people with the power to fix it, how long before the problem fixes itself in the worst possible way? The answer was coming, and it was going to cost more than anyone had publicly admitted. There is a version of the Target Canada story that places the blame on bad software and rushed timelines. It is not a wrong version, but it is an incomplete one. The SAP data errors were real. The compressed expansion schedule was real. The mismatch between Zeller's real estate Target standards was real. But each of those problems had a human decision behind it. Someone chose the timeline. Someone approved the budget. Someone signed the contracts. And when the people on the ground started sending signals that something was seriously wrong, someone, many someones, decided that the signals could be managed rather than answered. That is where the real story lives. Not in the software, in the decisions. The first decision, the one that made every other mistake harder to survive, was the purchase of the Zellers leases. $1,825 million. That number deserves to sit on its own for a moment, because it shaped everything that followed. When Target Corporation paid that sum to Hudson's Bay Company in 2011, it was not simply buying store locations, it was buying obligations, lease commitments that ran for years, renovation requirements that came with those leases, and a physical footprint that had been designed for a different retailer, serving a different market, operating under a different set of standards. The Zellers estate was not a blank canvas. It was a collection of compromises, stores tucked into aging plazas, stores with ceiling heights that did not meet Target's design specifications, stores in secondary markets that Target's American site selection process would never have approved. Target's expansion model in the United States had always been disciplined about location. The company had spent decades learning which intersections, which demographics, which traffic patterns produced a profitable Target store. That knowledge did not transfer automatically to Canada, and the Zellers portfolio, assembled over decades by a discount retailer with different priorities, reflected none of it. Renovation costs per location ran between $10 and $11 million on average. For the 133 stores that ultimately opened, that represented an additional capital outlay of well over $1 billion on top of the lease purchase price before a single Canadian customer had bought a single item. The financial foundation of Target Canada was underwater before the first store opened its doors. But the lease purchase, as consequential as it was, might have been survivable with the right operational execution. What compounded it was the decision about infrastructure. Target Corporation's American supply chain was one of the great competitive advantages in retail. Decades of investment had produced a logistics network of extraordinary efficiency, distribution centers positioned strategically across the country, vendor relationships built on years of volume and trust, transportation networks optimized to the level of individual store delivery windows. It was a system that worked because it had been built deliberately, tested continuously, and refined through the accumulation of real operational experience. Canada needed its own version of that system. Building it would take time, significant investment, and the willingness to treat Canada as a genuinely distinct market requiring genuinely distinct solutions. Instead, Target attempted to extend and adapt its American infrastructure northward. The distribution center in Cornwall, Ontario was stood up quickly. Vendor relationships were established under pressure. The SAP implementation, which in a properly sequenced rollout would have been piloted, tested, and corrected before being deployed at scale, was launched across the entire chain simultaneously. The reasoning was not irrational, given the constraints. The lease obligations were running. The renovation costs were accumulating. Every month of delay was a month of expense without revenue. The pressure to open stores, to start generating sales, to begin the process of paying back the enormous capital already committed, that pressure was structural, built into the deal from the moment it was signed. But pressure is not an excuse. It is an explanation, and the explanation does not change what the decision produced. A supply chain that was not ready, a software system running on corrupted data, a store network expanding faster than the operational foundation beneath it could support, and a timeline that left no room to discover any of this before it was too late to fix. The people who made these decisions were not villains. They were executives operating within the logic of a deal they had already committed to, inside a corporate culture that had internalized its own success as evidence of its own infallibility. Target had not failed before. Target did not have well-developed institutional muscle for what failure looked like or what it required. What it required in Canada was the courage to stop, to look at the data, the real data, not the SAP data, and say, this is not working. We need to slow down. We need to rebuild the foundation. We need to accept that the timeline we committed to publicly is a timeline we cannot meet responsibly. That conversation did not happen. Or if it happened, it did not reach the level where decisions could be changed, and the stores kept opening. By early 2014, the financial results had made the internal conversation unavoidable. Target Canada had lost $941 million in 2013. Not $941 million in projected losses or accounting adjustments. $941 million in actual operating losses in a single year from a chain that had not yet finished opening its stores. The number was staggering. It was the kind of number that ends careers and changes board compositions and forces the kind of honest reckoning that optimistic projections had been deferring for 2 years. The original financial model for Target Canada had projected a path to profitability by 2015. After the 2013 results came in, that projection was revised. Profitability, the new model suggested, might be achievable by 2021. 7 years away. 7 more years of losses at a scale the company had never experienced anywhere in its history, in a market that was showing no signs of turning in the direction the models required. The employee experience during this period was defined by a particular kind of institutional gaslighting. Not deliberate, not malicious, but real in its effect. Frontline workers in the stores and distribution centers had known for months, in some cases for nearly a year, that the operation was not functioning. They had filed reports, they had flagged problems, they had watched the gap between what the company communicated publicly and what they experienced daily grow wider with each passing month. In the Cornwall Distribution Center, workers had developed informal workarounds, manual processes designed to compensate for what the SAP system could not reliably do. Store managers had begun making ad hoc purchasing decisions, sourcing product locally to fill gaps that the official supply chain was failing to address. These were not sanctioned solutions. They were survival responses from people trying to do their jobs in a system that was working against them. Meanwhile, at the executive level, the gap between Minneapolis and Canada had become a structural problem in its own right. Target Canada's senior leadership operated in Mississauga, Ontario, but real decision-making authority remained in Minnesota. The organizational design reflected an assumption that had never been explicitly tested, that a Canadian subsidiary could be effectively governed by an American parent company operating from a different country, making decisions about a market it did not inhabit. Every significant budget decision, every major strategic call, every response to the emerging crisis required alignment with Minneapolis. And Minneapolis, insulated by distance and by the optimistic reporting that corporate cultures tend to generate when the news is bad, was consistently slower to grasp the severity of the situation than the people living inside it. A former Target Canada executive, speaking to the Financial Post after the collapse, described the dynamic with precision. The people in Canada knew what was happening. The challenge was making Minnesota understand it in a way that produced action rather than reassurance. That failure of organizational communication, the inability of a large corporation to transmit accurate information from the front lines to the decision makers, was not unique to Target. It is a recurring pattern in the history of corporate collapse. The people who see the problem first are rarely the people with the power to fix it, and by the time the problem reaches the people with the power, it has often grown past the point where fixing it is still a viable option. By the middle of 2014, there were people inside Target Canada who had reached a private conclusion that the public announcement would not confirm for another 6 months. This was not going to work. Not with more time, not with more investment, not with better marketing or revised projections or the kind of determined optimism that had carried the expansion this far. The foundation was wrong. The economics were wrong. The gap between what Target Canada was and what it needed to be, and what it would cost to close that gap, had grown beyond what any reasonable analysis could justify. Who was supposed to say it out loud? The executives whose careers were tied to the success of the venture? The board that had approved the original deal? The CEO who had championed the expansion as the centerpiece of Target Corporation's international ambitions? And who was going to protect the 17,600 people who had taken jobs at Target Canada in good faith, who had shown up every day, stocked the shelves, answered the questions, absorbed the complaints, while the decision about their futures was being made in a building they had never visited by people who had never learned their names? The answer to that question arrived on a January morning in 2015. It arrived without warning, and it arrived for everyone at the same time. The morning of January 15, 2015 began like any other Thursday for most Target Canada employees. They drove to work in the dark. They clocked in. They began the opening routines, unlocking stockroom doors, checking overnight delivery manifests, preparing registers for the day. In stores across 9 provinces, from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific, 17,600 people started their shifts without knowing that by the time most Canadians sat down for breakfast, their employment would be over. The announcement came through internal channels first, just after 7 in the morning. Store managers were called into back offices. District managers were on phones. The message was the same everywhere, delivered in the careful language of corporate crisis. Target Canada Co. would be filing for creditor protection under the company's Creditors Arrangement Act. All 133 stores would be closing. The process would begin immediately. For the employees hearing it in break rooms and back offices across the country, the careful language did not soften what it meant. In a Target store in Ancaster, Ontario, a young woman who had been with the company since opening day sat down on a stock cart in the receiving area and called her husband. In a store in Edmonton, Alberta, a department manager who had turned down another job offer 6 months earlier because he believed Target was stabilizing, stood in the housewares aisle and stared at a shelf he had just finished facing. In a store in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia, employees who had worked through Christmas, who had smiled at customers and processed returns and stocked shelves through the holidays, knowing from the rumors that had been circulating for weeks that something was coming, finally had confirmation of what that something was. The news reached the public within the hour. Brian Cornell, who had replaced Greg Steinhoffel as Target Corporation's CEO 8 months earlier, released a statement from Minneapolis. Target Canada had been unable to find a realistic path to profitability, the statement said. The decision to file for creditor protection was painful but necessary. Target Corporation remained committed to its American operations and to its long-term growth strategy. The Canadian press covered it with the particular tone reserved for things that are simultaneously shocking and, in retrospect, not surprising at all. The Globe and Mail, the Toronto Star, CBC News. The story led broadcasts and front pages across the country. Social media filled immediately, not with anger at first, but with something closer to stunned recognition. The people who had been photographing empty shelves and posting price comparisons for 18 months had been telling this story in fragments. Now the whole story was visible at once. Target Canada, the most anticipated retail arrival in Canadian history, had lasted 22 months. The mathematics of the failure were reported quickly because they were, by that point, not difficult to calculate. Target Corporation had invested approximately $5.4 billion in the Canadian venture. The lease purchase, the renovations, the infrastructure build-out. The operating losses accumulated across 2 fiscal years. Against that investment, the Canadian operation had never generated a single quarter of profit, not one. In 22 months of operation, Target Canada had moved from grand opening to creditor protection without passing through any of the intermediate stages that retail expansions are supposed to pass through. It was, by any measure, one of the largest and fastest retail failures in the history of North America. But the mathematics, as revealing as they were not the story that mattered most in the days that followed. The story that mattered was the one being lived by 17,600 people who had shown up for work on a Thursday morning and discovered that the company they worked for would not exist by spring. Under Canadian bankruptcy law, the creditor protection filing triggered a process managed by a court-appointed monitor, Ernst & Young, in this case, whose responsibility was to oversee the wind-down of the business in a way that balanced the interests of creditors, landlords, and employees. The process was orderly in the technical sense, but orderly processes have human contents that the technical description does not capture. Target Canada's severance obligations under the initial filing were minimal. Canadian bankruptcy law provided limited protection for employees of insolvent companies, and the initial terms offered to Target Canada workers reflected those limits. What followed was weeks of negotiation, monitored by the court, covered by the press, and watched closely by labor advocates and politicians who understood that 17,600 constituents had just lost their jobs through no fault of their own. The final severance terms, reached after significant public and legal pressure, were more substantial than the initial offer. Most employees received between 16 and 17 weeks of pay, depending on tenure. It was not nothing. For workers who had spent 2 years building something they had believed in, who had given Target Canada their best effort while the company's own systems were working against them. It was not enough either, but it was what the process produced. And through all of it, through the filing, the negotiations, the press coverage, the public reckoning, the stores stayed open. The liquidation sale began in the first week of February 2015. It started at 10% off, then 20, then the signs changed again. 30%, 40, the red clearance stickers multiplying across every department in every store in every province. And something strange happened. The stores that had spent 22 months failing to attract the consistent traffic that a viable retail operation requires suddenly filled with people. They came for the discounts. Of course they did. But there was something else in the air of those final weeks. Something that the people who worked those closing shifts described afterward with a consistency that suggests it was real. A kind of complicated grief. Customers who had complained about Target Canada for months were now walking its aisles one last time with something that looked, unexpectedly, like affection. As if the act of losing something, even something that had disappointed them, clarified what they had wanted it to be. The shelves emptied in a different way than they had before. Not because the supply chain had failed to fill them, but because everything was being bought and not replaced. Display fixtures disappeared. Mannequins were sold. The bones of the stores became visible as the merchandise thinned. The infrastructure of a retail operation disassembled in public, piece by piece over the course of weeks. The employees worked through it. They processed the clearance transactions and answered the questions, and directed customers to whatever remained in whatever department was still stocked. Some of them had already found new jobs. Some were still looking. Some were working their final shifts in a store they had opened 2 years earlier, serving customers who were, in some cases, buying things they had wanted to buy at full price but couldn't justify, now buying them at half price, on their way out the door. In Toronto, at a location that had been one of Target Canada's flagship stores, the final days drew customers who had shopped there from the beginning. Some of them took photographs, not of products, of the space itself, the architecture of the place that was about to become something else. The last Target Canada stores closed in April 2015. Different locations on different days, as the liquidation completed at different paces across the country. There was no single closing ceremony, no coordinated final moment. The stores simply reached the end of their inventory and locked their doors one by one until there were none left. The buildings remained, empty in most cases, for months. In some cities for longer. A retail space without its tenant is a specific kind of absence, larger than the store that occupied it somehow. The parking lots were still there. The signage brackets were still there after the red bullseye came down. The shapes of the aisles were still faintly visible in the flooring where the shelving units had stood. Ghost impressions of a store that had tried to be something it could not sustain. In Cornwall, Ontario, the distribution center that had been the operational heart of Target Canada's logistics network, the facility where workers had spent 2 years trying to manually compensate for a software system that could not tell the truth about its own inventory, was emptied and eventually repurposed. The infrastructure built to supply 133 stores across 9 provinces was dismantled and absorbed into other uses. Greg Steinhoffel had resigned 8 months before the end, in May 2014, officially in connection with a massive data breach that had compromised the credit card information of millions of American Target customers. The Canadian failure was not cited in the official announcement. It did not need to be. Everyone in the industry understood the full weight of what had been left behind. Brian Cornell, who had inherited both the American data breach and the Canadian collapse, oversaw the wind down with the measured efficiency of a CEO cleaning up someone else's decisions. He had been at the company for less than a year when the January announcement was made. Target Corporation, under his leadership, would go on to stabilize and eventually thrive in the American market. The Canadian chapter would be closed, written off, and filed away. For the 17,600 people who had lived inside that chapter, who had believed in it, worked for it, and been inside a back office or a break room or a receiving area on a Thursday morning in January when it ended, the filing away was not so simple. They had paid the price for decisions made in rooms they had never entered, by people who had never learned their names, about a country those people had looked at on a map and believed they understood. Who answers for that? When the last Target Canada store locked its doors in April 2015, the question that followed was the same one that follows every large retail collapse. Who picks up the pieces, and what do the pieces become? The answer, in Canada, was swift and unsentimental. Walmart Canada moved fastest. The company had been watching the Target Canada situation with the calm attention of a competitor who already knows the outcome. Within weeks of the January announcement, Walmart began hiring. Not quietly, publicly, deliberately, with job fairs held in cities where Target Canada locations were closing. They understood that 17,600 trained retail workers were about to enter the job market simultaneously, and they positioned themselves to absorb as many as possible. For Walmart, the collapse of Target Canada was not a tragedy. It was a market correction that returned customers and talent to a competitor that had earned them through years of consistent execution. Canadian Tire saw similar gains. So did Loblaws, which acquired a number of former Target Canada locations and converted them into real Canadian Superstore and Freshco outlets. Grocery formats that served the everyday household need that Target had promised to serve and consistently failed to deliver. Sport Chek, owned by Canadian Tire, took several locations in markets where Target had established a retail presence that someone else could now inherit. The geographic footprint of Target Canada did not disappear. It was redistributed. The same buildings that had been painted red and stocked, partially inconsistently, with Target merchandise became the buildings of other chains. In some cases within months. In others, the spaces sat empty long enough to become a different kind of story. The hollowed retail units that anchor store departures leave behind. Visible evidence of a bet that did not pay. The Hudson's Bay Company, which had sold the Zellers leases to Target for $1.8 billion in 2011, emerged from the transaction in a position that would have seemed improbable at the time of the deal. They had divested a struggling discount chain at a price that significantly exceeded its market value, taken the capital, and watched their buyer fail. Hudson's Bay would face its own serious difficulties in the years that followed. The department store sector was under pressure that no single transaction could resolve. But in the specific transaction of the Zeller sale, they had made an extraordinarily favorable deal. Target Corporation had paid full price for a portfolio of compromised assets, and Hudson's Bay had walked away with the money. The workers were not so cleanly resolved. The severance negotiation that followed the January filing had produced terms that were better than the initial offer and less than what the situation deserved. 16 to 17 weeks of pay, depending on tenure. For a worker who had been with Target Canada since the opening days of 2013, who had spent 2 years learning a system, building relationships with colleagues, turning down other opportunities because they believed the operation would stabilize. 16 weeks was a number that had been calculated by lawyers and monitors in bankruptcy proceedings. Not by any measure of what those 2 years had actually cost. Some workers landed well. Retail experience transfers. The people with strong track records and transferable skills found positions at Walmart, at Winners, at Canadian Tire, at the grocery chains that were expanding into the spaces Target had vacated. The job market for experienced retail workers in Canada in 2015 was not empty. It absorbed a significant portion of the displaced workforce within a reasonable time frame. But reasonable timeframes are not uniform. For older workers, for workers in smaller markets where the retail sector was thinner, for workers who had relocated for Target Canada positions, or who had structured their lives around the stability they believed the job represented, the transition was slower and harder. Their stories did not make the financial press. They were not quantified in the postmortems. They existed in the space between the headline number, 17,600 jobs, and the individual human reality that the headline number contains but does not describe. The business press moved quickly to diagnosis. Within months of the collapse, Target Canada had become a case study, not just in journalism, but in business schools, in retail industry conferences, in the kind of analytical retrospectives that large failures generate when the people who lived through them are ready to speak on the record. The diagnoses converged on familiar themes: the compressed expansion timeline, The SAP implementation failures, the Zellers real estate portfolio, the organizational distance between Minneapolis decision makers and Canadian operational reality. Each of these factors was real. Each contributed to the outcome. The analyses were not wrong, but the most important lesson of Target Canada was not operational, it was cultural. And it was a lesson that the retail industry had been taught before, in different contexts, by different companies, and had not fully absorbed. The lesson was this: proximity is not understanding. Canada and the United States share a border, a language, a century of cultural exchange, and an economic relationship of extraordinary depth and complexity. By almost any superficial measure, they are similar countries. And that surface similarity was precisely what made Canada dangerous for Target. It created the conditions for a specific kind of corporate overconfidence. The assumption that because the two markets looked alike, they were alike. That what worked in Minneapolis would work in Mississauga. That the supply chain that served Dallas could serve Calgary. That the customer in Winnipeg wanted the same things at the same prices through the same experience as the customer in Cincinnati. They did not. Not exactly. And in retail, exactly as everything. The price sensitivity of Canadian consumers was different. The competitive landscape was different. The regulatory environment, including the French language requirements in Quebec that Target's training materials initially failed to address, was different. The real estate market was different. The vendor ecosystem was different. The logistics infrastructure was different. None of these differences were insurmountable. Other American retailers had entered Canada successfully, but those retailers had entered carefully, with pilot programs and patience, and the institutional humility to treat Canada as a new market rather than an extension of an existing one. Target entered with $1,825 million already committed, 133 store locations already under lease, and a timeline that left no room for the kind of learning that genuine market entry requires. What does it cost when the people making decisions about a place have never truly inhabited that place? What is lost when the distance between the boardroom and the store floor becomes so great that the signals traveling between them arrive distorted beyond usefulness? Target Canada did not fail because Canada was hostile to it. Canada had wanted Target. Canada had waited for Target for 2 decades and greeted its arrival with genuine enthusiasm. Target Canada failed because the company that brought it there never fully committed to understanding what Canada actually was, as opposed to what it looked like from a conference room in Minneapolis. That distinction between the map and the territory, between the projection and the reality, is the real lesson of Target Canada. It is a lesson about the danger of mistaking familiarity for knowledge, about the organizational cost of cultures that cannot transmit bad news upward, about what happens when the people who see the problem first are not the people with the power to address it. Those lessons did not die with Target Canada. They went into the case studies and the conference presentations and the business school curricula. Whether they were truly learned, whether the next company preparing to cross a border into a market that looks familiar will stop long enough to ask whether familiar means the same, is a question that the history of corporate ambition does not answer with consistent optimism. What is certain is that the Canadians who waited 20 years for a Target and got 22 months deserved better than a lesson. They deserved a store. Remember the winter of 2013. Remember what it felt like to stand in a parking lot in Ontario or Alberta or British Columbia in the cold that February and March still carry in Canada and wait for a store to open. Not because you needed something urgently, not because there was nowhere else to buy it, but because this was Target. And Target had meant something to you for a long time. Longer than you could quite explain to someone who hadn't made the drive across the border themselves. You had been to the American ones. You knew the feeling, the particular quality of the light inside, the way the store was organized so that moving through it felt effortless rather than effortful. The private pleasure of a cart that was filling with things you needed and a few things you hadn't known you needed until you saw them. The red bags at the checkout. The sense, hard to justify rationally but absolutely real, that this store respected you in some small but consistent way. You had carried that feeling home across the border more than once. You had described it to people. You had looked forward for years to the day when you wouldn't have to cross anything to find it. And then the day came. And you walked in, and somewhere between the entrance and the third aisle, you understood that something was missing. You couldn't name it precisely, but you knew. You went back anyway, more than once. Because the thing you had been waiting for deserved more than one chance. Because hope is not easily surrendered when it has been held for 20 years. That loyalty was real. It deserved to be honored. It never was. Target Canada was not simply a retail failure. It was a particular kind of American story, one that does not always get told clearly, because it requires the teller to look honestly at something the country does not always wish to examine about itself. It is the story of what happens when confidence becomes indistinguishable from certainty, when a company that has succeeded so completely for so long in one place begins to believe that its success is a property of itself rather than a product of specific conditions, specific relationships, specific infrastructure, specific accumulated knowledge that cannot simply be transplanted. Target Corporation was not a bad company. It had built something genuinely admirable in the United States, a retail experience that millions of people valued and trusted, that had improved the lives of its customers in modest but real ways, that had provided good employment to hundreds of thousands of people over decades. That record was real, but real records do not transfer automatically. And the assumption that they do, the belief that what you have built in one place will simply work in another place because the two places look similar from a distance, is a form of arrogance so common in corporate history that it barely registers as arrogance anymore. It presents itself as confidence, as ambition, as vision, and it is indistinguishable from those things right up until the moment the stores go dark. 17,600 people went to work for Target Canada in good faith. They were not abstractions. They were men and women who learned a system, built relationships with colleagues, took pride in their departments, showed up through the difficulties of an operation that was struggling from its first week and never found stable ground. They were the ones who faced the customers whose carts held product that had been advertised but wasn't on the shelf. They were the ones who absorbed the frustration and the disappointment and the confusion and came back the next day and absorbed it again. They deserved a company that was as committed to their reality as they were. What they got instead was a company that was committed to its own projection of what their reality was supposed to look like. A company that had decided from a great distance what Canada was, and then spent 2 years and $5 billion discovering that it had been wrong. The gap between those two things, between the country Target thought it was entering and the country it actually entered, is where 17,600 careers and billions of dollars in 20 years of Canadian goodwill disappeared. That gap had a name. It was called not listening. It was called not asking. It was called looking at a map and believing you understand the territory because you can read the labels. The buildings are still there. Some of them are grocery stores now. Some are sporting goods stores. Some have been divided and subdivided into the smaller retail units that fill the space where a single anchor tenant used to be. A few sat empty long enough that the communities around them had time to consider what the absence meant. What it feels like when a large space that was supposed to be one thing becomes, for a period, nothing. The red bullseyes came down, the paint was covered, the signage brackets were removed and the holes were filled, and the facades became the facades of other stores, or of no store at all. But the people who worked those opening shifts in the spring of 2013, who stocked those shelves and trained on those systems, and believed in the way that people believe in a new job at a new place that seems to be building towards something, they remember. The details stay. The specific weight of a particular morning. The particular quality of the optimism that surrounded those first weeks, before the gap between the promise and the reality became impossible to ignore. They did the work. They showed up. They tried to make it function with the tools they were given, and the tools were inadequate, and they tried anyway. Somewhere tonight, a former Target Canada employee is describing those days to someone who wasn't there. The chaos of the inventory system, the empty shelves they couldn't explain to customers, the January morning when the announcement came through and the shift they were working became the last shift that would ever matter. The person listening will not have been there. They will not have felt the specific cold of that Canadian winter or understood from the inside what it meant to believe in something that the people above you had already quietly stopped believing in. But they will understand from the way it is described that something real happened here, that real people built something with their hands and their time and their trust in good faith and were let down by decisions made far above them and far away. That is worth remembering, not because remembering changes anything, but because the people who showed up deserve at least that much, to have their story told accurately and with the weight it carries by someone who understands what it cost.